The second time Dorian Ashcomb's night crew laughed at me, I was on my knees in the elevator lobby of the Halcyon Tower, scraping gum off marble with a butter knife, because the maintenance budget didn't stretch to solvent anymore. My name is Mira Voss. I was 29 years old, licensed for nothing, trusted with a mop and a master key, and I had once designed the roof trusses for 3 hospitals before a collapse that wasn't my fault ended my career in a single afternoon. I still carried my father's brass spirit level in my cart, its glass cracked in one corner, the bubble drifting a hair off true no matter how you set it down. That night, I ran my hand along a hairline seam behind the elevator paneling and felt something I recognized in my bones before my mind caught up. Cold air, where no cold air should be. A gap where load should be carried, not hidden. I had felt that exact wrongness once before, in a building that came down 11 months later and killed 6 people while my name got printed under the word negligence. I stood there in the dark, with my flashlight shaking, and upstairs, 40 floors above the mop water, the woman they called the Iron Widow was hosting a party for people who would never learn my name. If a story like this makes your chest do that thing where it forgets how to sit still, go ahead and subscribe to the channel before we go any further. I'll wait. I didn't have a badge for the 40th floor. I had a service elevator key, and 11 minutes before my shift supervisor noticed I was gone. I took both. The doors opened onto candlelight and string quartet, and a woman in emerald silk saying something about quarterly returns to a man who nodded like his neck was on a hinge. I had seen photographs of Celine Cade before, never enough of them, because she made sure of that, but nothing prepared me for the room rearranging itself around her, like she was the only source of gravity in it. Black hair pulled back hard enough to look like armor, a stillness that read as patience to people who didn't know better, and as a held breath to people who did. When I came close enough, the air around her carried vetiver and cold rain, sharp enough to cut. I smelled it before I smelled the wine, the candle wax, the money, my own scent. I've been told it runs warm, brown sugar, and clean linen. The kind of thing that used to embarrass me in exam rooms, spiked with fear so fast a man beside her wrinkled his nose in distaste. Ma'am. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. I need 30 seconds. There's a structural issue on floor 12, behind the north elevator bank. I have photographs. She looked at me the way you look at a fire alarm going off in a building with no smoke. Not unkind, worse than unkind. Absent, Corvin, she said, to a broad-shouldered man at her elbow, and that was all. He had my arm before I finished my next sentence, steering me toward the service doors with a grip that wasn't cruel, just final. Please, I said, digging my phone out of my apron pocket, thumb already unlocking it. Just take my number. Someone could call me back. Verify, ma'am, you need to leave the event. I got close enough to set the phone on the Matrida station, my number glowing on the screen, before a woman in a charcoal suit, Celine's assistant, I'd learn later, a woman named Priya, with a mouth built for saying no, picked it up between 2 fingers like it might be contagious, read it once, and typed something into her own device. I didn't understand what she'd done until security walked me out through the kitchen, and I tried, humiliated, hands shaking, to call the tip line myself. My contact wouldn't go through. Blocked. Not declined. Blocked. The kind that doesn't even ring. The kind reserved for people who have been decided about. I stood in the rain behind the loading dock with my father's level digging into my hip through the cart strap, and I thought, they will never see me. Not the tormentors from Belhaven, not this glass tower full of people warmed by money I would never touch, not her. I went home, slept 4 hours, and came back for my shift the next evening, already grieving a version of hope I hadn't realized I still had. The building had new signs in the lobby, Cade Holdings, brushed steel, still smelling of adhesive. Overnight, in the time it takes most people to sleep off a party, Celine Cade had acquired the Halcyon Tower in a hostile buyout that made 3 financial channels lead with her photograph. My supervisor, a weary beta named Frank, who had never once learned my last name, told us all in the stairwell that the old ownership group had been restructured out effective immediately and that Ashcombe Development no longer controlled the property. I didn't understand yet that she had spent the entire night I was cursing her name, reading everything her people could find about a fired structural engineer named Mira Voss, and about a fraud case 11 months deep that had never quite added up. I found that out from Dee. Dee Alvarez had cleaned floors beside me for 2 years, the kind of beta who said exactly what she thought and never apologized for the volume of it. She found me refilling my cart on the 10th floor, grinning like she'd swallowed good news whole. New management gave everyone a raise and a coffee machine, she said. Real one. Grinds beans. And guess who they want in a meeting on 40 at 9 sharp? Not me. You, specifically, by name. She handed me a paper cup, steam curling off it, and the smell hit me before the taste did. Cardamom, dark and warm, my father's Sunday morning ritual, a flavor I hadn't ordered anywhere in 4 years because it cost too much and hurt too much to drink alone. Whoever's running procurement up there did their homework, Dee said. That's not from the building's old machine. Someone special ordered that blend this morning. I told myself it was coincidence. I believed it for exactly as long as it took me to ride the elevator to the 40th floor and find Celine Cade standing at the window with her back to the door, vetiver and rain rolling off her like weather, a manila folder open on the desk beside her holding a printout of my Belhaven collapse report. Every page I'd written 11 months ago, flagged and highlighted like something worth saving. You came back, I said, because it was the only true thing in the room. I read your incident file at 2 a.m, she said, without turning. You flagged retrofit shortcuts on load-bearing columns 18 months before Belhaven came down. Your supervisor buried the memo. The inspector who signed off on the retrofit was paid by the same holding company that owns half of this tower's original construction contracts. She turned then, and for the first time I saw something underneath the stillness. Not warmth, not yet, but attention, focused entirely on me like I was the only structural risk in the building worth assessing. I didn't come back for the tower, Miss Voss. I came back because you were right, and I blocked the only number that could have proven it 11 hours before I found that out. You could have just apologized. I don't apologize. A pause, waited, I correct. Buying a 40-story building is a strange way to say sorry. Something almost like humor moved through her face and didn't quite land. It seemed proportionate. I laughed before I could stop myself, and the sound surprised us both. She studied me the way she'd studied the folder, cataloging, and I felt it in my chest, a warmth that had no business showing up in a room this cold, that should not have happened, and did anyway. Dorian Ashcombe cut corners on this building the same way he cut them on the one that fell on my crew, I said. If I'm right, floor 12 isn't the only place he hid it. Then show me, Celine said. Everything, starting now. I want to tell you I hesitated, weighed the risk, remembered the last time I trusted a room full of powerful people with the truth and watched it eat me alive. I didn't. I picked up my father's level, set it flat on her desk between us, and watched the bubble drift, stubborn, off-center, same as always. Check twice, I said. Trust the level, not your eyes. That's what my father used to say before every inspection. I looked up at her. I'm asking you to trust it too. She looked at the level for a long moment, then at me. I trust receipts, she said, but I'll look at your level. It was, I would come to understand, the closest thing to a vow she knew how to give a stranger. We spent the next 6 days inside the building's bones. I walked floor after floor with a flashlight and a tablet, photographing every seam that didn't sit right, while Priya trailed us with a legal pad and Corvin argued with contractors in the basement about permit records that didn't match the blueprints on file. Celine rearranged her entire empire around a 12-story audit like it was the only account that mattered. I learned her signatures the way you learn weather, a thumb dragged slow across her palm when she was holding back a temper, a stillness that deepened right before she said something true. The apartment they gave me while my old unit's lease ran out was 2 floors below the penthouse, absurdly large, empty in a way that made my footsteps echo. Celine showed up the second night, with a paper bag of takeout and no explanation, and stood in my kitchen doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed past it. "You didn't have to," I said. "You hadn't eaten since noon." Corvin told me. A pause. I notice things. It isn't always tact. Sometimes it's just noticing. You noticed my coffee order from a report I filed 11 months ago. I noticed you flinch every time someone calls you Miss Voss like it's an accusation. She set the bag on the counter, careful, like it might break. I'd like to stop being one of the people who does that. We ate at the counter, standing, because neither of us moved to sit. She asked about my father, an engineer too, dead 6 years, heart giving out the year after Belhaven, though no doctor would ever put that on the certificate. I asked about the tower acquisitions, the epithet the financial press had hung on her like a collar, the Iron Widow. I watched her face do something complicated when I said it. My wife, she said, was an architect. Rosalind, the name came out carefully, like she was setting down something fragile. She died in a fire in a building her own firm designed, because the developer swapped the fire-rated cladding for something cheaper after inspection. I built an empire out of buying buildings like that one and fixing what killed her. I never told anyone that part. It sounds like grief dressed up as ambition. It sounds like both, I said. They're not mutually exclusive. Her hand found the counter's edge, not mine, close enough that the distance felt deliberate. You should know I don't do this. Whatever this is. A breath. I haven't wanted anyone in this apartment, or any apartment, in 4 years. I haven't wanted anyone to notice me in 4 years. I set my fork down. We're either very bad at this, or exactly matched. "Tell me to stop, and I will," she said, low, before her hand ever moved. "Don't stop," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. She didn't kiss me that night. She rested her forehead against mine for a long, careful moment, vetiver and rain and something underneath it gone warm, and said, "Not yet. Not until Ashcombe is finished. I won't hand him a story to poison this with. It should have frustrated me. Instead, it steadied something in my chest that had been shaking since the night she blocked my number. Because for the first time in years, someone was protecting the good thing instead of spending it. Dorian Ashcombe reappeared on a Tuesday in a courtroom lobby, wearing a suit that cost more than my father's funeral and a smile that had gotten 3 separate juries to acquit him of things everyone knew he'd done. His lawyer served me with a reopened negligence claim from Belhaven that afternoon, recycled. Dressed up in new language, timed with a precision that told me exactly who had made the call to refile it. "Funny," Ashcombe said, catching me alone by the elevators, close enough that I could smell cologne trying to cover something sour underneath. "Your new friend upstairs buys my building, and suddenly you remember how to point fingers." His voice dropped. Pleasant, terrible. People believed you the first time, for about a week. Let's see how long they believe you now that you're sleeping with the woman who profits from destroying me. I'm not sleeping with anyone, I said. And you cut corners on load-bearing steel that killed 6 people. Everything else is noise. Prove it, he said, and walked away like a man who had already won. 2 nights later, the storm that had been threatening the city all week finally broke, and the building's old service stairwell, the one Ashcomb's crew had patched instead of properly reinforced, groaned under water pressure it was never rated for. I was on floor 12 when the lights failed, cataloging a support column with a headlamp, and Celine found me there in the dark 30 seconds after the first tremor ran up through the concrete like a held breath finally released. Out, she said, already pulling me toward the stairwell door, and then the door wouldn't open, warped by water, and the tremor came again, longer, and dust sifted down from the ceiling tile like snow. We stood pressed into the stairwell landing, her arms braced on either side of me, not because either of us needed rescuing yet, but because the alternative was falling debris. And I felt her heartbeat through her shirt, fast, controlled, a woman used to commanding fear instead of feeling it. The columns compromised, not gone, I said into the dark, running my hand along the seam I'd been photographing. Ashcomb's retrofit skipped the secondary bracing. It'll hold another hour if nothing else stresses it. How do you know? Because I designed the original spec for a building exactly like this one, and I know what corners get cut when someone's saving money instead of lives. Her hand found my jaw in the dark, gentle, deliberate, "You've been right about everything since the night I threw you out of my own party. You didn't throw me out. Corvin did." I let him. Her thumb moved along my cheekbone. Slow, I've been correcting that mistake for 2 weeks. The stairwell door gave way behind us before either of us said the 3 words sitting in the air between us, security flooding through with flashlights and Corvin's voice cutting through the dark, and the moment folded itself away, unfinished, waiting, 3 days after the storm. Celine took me to the 40th floor's private wing for the first time, a room I hadn't known existed, kept locked, smelling faintly of cedar polish and old paper. A drafting table stood against the far wall, covered in a canvas sheet gone gray with years of dust. Under it, blueprints in a hand I didn't recognize, precise, elegant, dated 14 years back. "Rosalind's," Celine said. "I couldn't move them, and I couldn't look at them. I don't know which impulse won more days than the other. I ran my fingers along the edge of one drawing, careful. She drew load paths in red. Same as my father did. She used to say a building only lies to people who don't ask it the right questions." Celine sat on the stool beside the table, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked smaller than the room around her. My mother raised me to believe control was the only language love speaks in. Keep the empire, keep the walls up, never let anyone close enough to see the cracks. I built 40 floors of glass and never once asked myself if the woman inside was load-bearing or just varnish. She looked at me. "You're the first person who's made me want to find out." I told her about my father then, the whole of it. The stress that finally stopped his heart a year after Belhaven, the way I'd stopped eating cardamom coffee because it tasted like a man I couldn't save, the way I'd carried his cracked level through 4 years of mop water because setting it down felt like losing him twice. She listened with her whole body still, the way she listened to nothing else, and when I finished, she didn't offer comfort I could see through. She reached over and set her hand flat over mine, over the level, over the bubble drifting stubbornly off true. "I'll get it recalibrated," she said. "There's a man in the old district who restores instruments like this. I looked it up the week we met. You don't have to fix everything for me." "I know," she said. "I want to anyway." We made dinner that night in her kitchen, badly, both of us laughing at how neither of us knew how long to boil rice, and somewhere between the burnt garlic and the second bottle of wine I understood, without either of us saying it, that whatever this was had stopped being temporary. She kissed me at the counter, slow, asking with her whole body before she asked with her mouth, and I answered by not pulling away. And for 1 full hour the tower and the lawsuit and Ashcombe's smile did not exist. Then Corvin knocked, hard, and his face when the door opened told us both the hour was over. "Someone broke into Miss Voss's old apartment," he said. "Took the Belhaven case files. All of them." Dee called me at 6 the next morning, her voice thin and wrong, and told me 2 men had followed her from the subway the night before, that she hadn't slept, that she was scared in a way she'd never let herself sound before. By noon, the story broke across 3 tabloids at once, 2 coordinated to be coincidence, photographs of me and Celine from the storm night, grainy and cropped to look furtive. Under headlines that used words like scheme and seduce and gold-digging cleaner, buys her way into billion-dollar bed. Ashcombe's fingerprints were all over the timing, but proving that meant nothing against the speed of the damage. Celine's board convened an emergency call before I finished reading the 3rd article. I stood outside her office door and heard fragments through the wood, investor confidence, optics, the company's exposure, and heard, worse, long stretches of Celine's silence where I expected her to fight. She came out an hour later with her face arranged into the stillness I'd first met at the party, the one that read as patience to people who didn't know better. "I need to ask you to stay away from the tower for a few days," she said. "Until the board settles, you're choosing them. I'm protecting the thing that lets me protect you at all." Her voice didn't waver, and that was somehow worse than if it had. "It's temporary. That's what my old firm said before they buried my report," I said, and walked out before I let her see exactly how much that cost me. My badge failed at the lobby turnstile the next morning. Someone had already revoked it. I stood in the rain outside the tower I had once tried to save, soaked through, holding a duffel bag with everything I owned in it, because Dee had texted me not to go home, her own apartment ransacked in the night, my father's original site photographs, the ones I'd kept as backup. The ones that proved the pattern went back years before Belhaven, gone from the drawer where I'd hidden them. Ashcombe had taken the one thing I had left to prove I wasn't a liar, and the one person who could have stood beside me had, for 1 terrible hour, let the door close between us. I didn't cry. I stood in the rain with my father's level in my bag and thought about the word he used to say before every hard inspection. "Check twice. Trust the level. Not your eyes, not your fear, not the people who've already decided who you are." I had backups. I always kept backups, because I had learned the hard way what happens when you trust a single copy of the truth to survive a man like Dorian Ashcombe. I found Dee at a diner 2 blocks from the old apartment, hands shaking around a coffee cup, and she told me between sips that the men who'd taken her files had asked, specifically, about a storage unit. A unit she'd forgotten I even had, rented under my father's name, full of the boxes I couldn't bear to sort after he died. I understood then what Ashcombe didn't know, that my backups had been sitting untouched in a dead man's name for 4 years, invisible in the exact way I had learned to be invisible, and that invisibility, for once, was going to save us both. We drove out that night in Dee's borrowed car, the storm still hanging wet in the air, and by 2 a.m. I had spread 11 years of my father's meticulous field notes across a storage unit's concrete floor, inspection logs, photographs, correspondence with 3 separate developers who'd hired him to sign off on shortcuts he refused every time. Buried in a folder marked with a date 9 years old was a memo my father had written, never sent, naming Ashcombe Development directly, flagging a cladding substitution on a building I recognized the moment I read the address. Rosalind Cade's building. The one that killed her. My hands went cold reading it. My father had known. He'd tried to stop it, quietly, the way he tried to stop everything, and it had cost him nothing at the time, because the fire hadn't happened yet. And it had cost him everything 11 months later, because Ashcombe remembered his name. I called Celine at 3 a.m. with my voice shaking too hard to explain properly, and she didn't ask why I'd left, didn't ask for an apology for the badge or the board or the silence. She said, "Where are you?" and was in a car before I finished giving the address. Ashcombe's men found the storage facility 20 minutes before she did. There were 2 of them, and Dee between them and the door when I came around the corner with an armful of files. And for one long second, I thought about every time I had made myself small to survive a room. I didn't make myself small this time. I set the boxes down, put myself between the men and my friend, and said, in a voice that came from somewhere I didn't know I still had, "Everything in that unit is already photographed and sent to 4 separate email accounts you'll never find. Touch either of us and you're not stealing evidence. You're confessing to a felony on camera." I nodded at the security light blinking red above the door, a bluff, mostly, and watched it land anyway. Celine arrived as the larger of the 2 men stepped toward me, and she didn't hesitate the way people hesitate when violence is a decision instead of an instinct. She put herself in the space between his hand and my shoulder, took the shove meant for me across her own ribs, and put him on the ground with a speed that told me exactly how much restraint she'd been carrying since the night we met. Corvin's security team arrived behind her, and within minutes, both men were zip-tied on the wet concrete, and Celine was still standing over them with her hands shaking, not from fear. "You could have killed him," I said quietly, catching her wrist before her hand closed into something final. She looked at me, breathing hard, vetiver and rain gone sharp with adrenaline. "He put his hands near you." "I know." I held on. "Don't become the thing you hate to protect me. I need you to be better than that, not just stronger." Something in her unclenched, slow, like a wall finally allowed to stop bearing weight it was never meant to carry alone. "Okay," she said, "and let the man go to the police instead of the ground." And I understood in that moment that I had just watched an empire choose mercy over its own instincts, and that the choosing had been for me. The press conference happened 4 days later, in the Halcyon Tower's restored lobby, marble scrubbed clean of gum and grief both. I stood at a podium I had no right to expect and laid out 11 years of my father's field notes beside my own Belhaven report and the Halcyon retrofit photographs, page by page, in front of every camera Dorian Ashcombe's money had ever bought off. I named the falsified inspections. I named the cladding substitution that killed Rosalind Cade. I watched Ashcombe's lawyer's face go the color of wet paper as the timeline assembled itself in real time in front of 40 reporters who had spent a week calling me a gold-digging opportunist. "This woman," Celine said, stepping up beside me when I finished, her hand finding mine in front of every camera in the room without a flicker of hesitation, tried to warn me about this building the night I met her, and I had her removed from a party for it. I am telling you that in public, because I would rather be humiliated by my own mistake than let anyone believe hers was smaller than mine. Mira Voss is the reason this tower is still standing. She is the reason I am. Ashcombe was arrested that afternoon, on site, in front of the same lobby he'd once owned, and the sound of the room that had sneered at me for weeks going silent around his handcuffs was the sweetest thing I had heard in 4 years. The old Belhaven case reopened within the week, this time in my favor. My father's name and mine both cleared in the same court filing. That night, in the penthouse, with the city lit gold below us and the storm finally, completely past, Celine knelt in front of me on the rug by the window and took both my hands in hers. "I want to give you a bond, Mark," she said, quiet, careful, not because instinct is telling me to, because I've thought about it with a clear head every day since the storm, and I still want it. But I need you to hear me ask properly, because you deserve a question, not a claim. "Ask me," I said. "Mira Voss, will you let me mark you? Will you let this be permanent, in every sense a bond can be?" Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. "Tell me to stop, and I will, for the rest of my life, if that's what you need." "Don't stop," I said, and this time there was nothing standing between us. And the answer. Her mouth found the curve of my throat, gentle, and the bite that followed was slow enough to be a question answered twice, once in words, once in body, and the bond that snapped into place between us felt less like being claimed and more, finally, like being found. 6 months later, on a morning bright enough to turn the harbor to hammered silver, we were married on the Halcyon Towers' restored roof garden, under a trellis Rosalind Cade had once sketched in red ink and Celine had finally been able to build. Dee stood beside me in a dress she complained about for a week and cried through anyway. Corvin gave a toast that started with, "In 11 years I have never once seen this woman wait for anyone," and ended with him openly weeping, which surprised no one more than him. My father's level sat on the small table beside our rings, freshly restored by the old district craftsman Celine had found, its glass replaced, its bubble finally perfectly centered. A year on, Dorian Ashcombe sat in a state prison serving a sentence that would outlast his money, his firm dissolved, his name struck from 3 buildings that had quietly renamed themselves rather than carry it. Dee ran her own small cleaning company now, one that Cade Holdings kept as a permanent contractor out of loyalty rather than charity, and she liked to remind me, loudly, at every family dinner, that she had known I was destined for better things back when I was still scraping gum off marble with a butter knife. Celine still wakes some mornings with the old stillness in her shoulders, the inherited belief that control is safety, but she reaches for my hand now instead of the wall, and I have learned that love, for a woman raised to mistake power for peace, is a discipline chosen fresh every day, rather than a feeling that simply arrives and stays. We talk sometimes, quietly, about a nursery down the hall from the room where Rosalind's blueprints now hang restored and honored instead of hidden, though we've made no promises yet beyond wanting to. This morning I stood at our window while the light came up gold over the harbor, my father's level on the sill beside me, its bubble sitting dead center in glass that no longer remembers being cracked. I used to believe that being overlooked was simply the shape of my life, a wall I would spend forever leaning against without anyone noticing the weight I carried. I know now that some people are never invisible. They are only waiting for someone patient enough and brave enough to finally look twice. The end. If a story about being overlooked your whole life and then finally, completely seen, found its way into your chest tonight, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. And I'd love to know, if you were Mira, standing in that rain with a blocked number and a warning no one wanted to hear, would you have walked back into that tower the next morning? Or walked away for good? Tell me in the comments. Until next time, sleep well, and I'll see you inside the next story.